if you think that the government can impose a carbon tax, skim hundreds of millions of dollars off the top, and then charge its sales tax on top of the carbon tax, and somehow make you better off with rebates, then I've got some Ocean View property in Lethbridge to sell you.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everybody. With so many different stories coming out about something financial related, whether it be the new clarifying report on the carbon tax, which the Liberals and the Conservatives seemingly still disagreeing on what the report actually says, with a recent court ruling on taxing Airbnb, residential housing sales, and Pierre Poilievre's newest announcement on homes and saving Canadians money. We decided to get one of the experts in here to talk to us about it, and we are so happy that he and his organization have been able to spare us that time, because honestly, there's no other source that we would rather go to, because they are unbiased, they don't mess around, and they just give you the straight goods on the information that you're looking for all things tax related and financial related when it comes to federal parliament. So without further ado, please welcome back Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Franco, welcome back.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Happy to be on the show with you folks today. Excellent.
So let's just dive into what is the recent announcement from Pierre Poilievre. He's cutting taxes on home sales by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a great announcement. In fact, it's probably one of the best announcements, or maybe the best announcement that we've gotten or heard out of Ottawa in quite some time, to actually make homes more affordable for Canadians, right? So Mr. Poilievre just announced that if he is to form the next government, then he would take the sales tax off of new homes under $1 million, right? So you're talking about saving families tens of thousands of dollars when they buy a new home. In fact, it could save a family up to $50,000, right? And the reason that we say this is so good is because, like, look, there's really one thing that a government can do to make building and buying homes more affordable immediately, and that is stop taxing so much, right? You've seen different reports, whether it's out of the Home Builders Association in Vancouver, whether it's out of the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis, that government fees, charges, and taxes could add up to 31% to the price of a new home. And one of the big taxes are sales taxes. So instead of these wasteful government spending programs that build bureaucracy, the best way the government can actually encourage more homes to be built and more affordable homes is just to cut taxes. And that's exactly what Mr. Poilievre is promising today.
Well, and because we've seen families go through this, and it's so significant, because I think what most people may not realize is that initial price on the taxes ends up being kind of carried through the life of the home. So over that life of the home, it ends up being that much more expensive. So even when you're reselling it, that can actually have an impact on it. And never mind the actual execution of collecting that HST, because there's this HST rebate process that you can go through with the new builders and all of that. And never mind the fact that this would just, I think, incentivize developers to build even more homes, because it cuts all of that bureaucracy out and it cuts the taxes out.
Well, that's exactly it, right? There's two things that this tax cut promise does. Number one, I mean, it directly reduces the price of a home if you're cutting the sales tax out of the equation, right? So you're making it more affordable for that younger family, or any Canadian, to buy their first new home. But the second thing, and to your point, is that it reduces costs on the developers and the construction of the new home, right? So if you reduce costs to build a new home, guess what? You get more new homes. And at the end of the day, that is the solution to the housing crisis in Canada. We need more supply. We need to encourage developers and the construction to build new homes. And so that's the two things that this announcement does. Number one, directly reduces the price by taking the sales tax off of new homes under $1 million. But number two, it encourages more development. And when you have more development, you have more supply and you have more competition, which forces prices down in every sector, but specifically with this announcement in the housing sector, i.e., make homes more affordable.
So I have a feeling that critics of this policy are going to say things like, oh, well, it's not going to benefit Canadians at all. It's really just going to benefit builders. And they're the ones that are going to reap the benefits of this tax cut. What's the reality of that?
Well, the reality is completely wrong, and it kind of ties in to my other points, right? If you make that argument, you're just factually incorrect because number one, I mean, you are going to be making life more affordable directly by taking the 5% federal sales tax off the home price, right? But number two, I guess this gets to the devil's advocate that you're playing, right? Is that if you encourage more supply, you have more competition, right? So you have more developers competing with each other to try to get people to buy homes. Like that is the way that you reduce prices in every sector, right? It's economics 101. And that also applies to the housing sector, right? Think about it. If you have more people trying to sell homes, then they have to compete with each other. And they do that by lowering prices to get people to buy those homes.
Well, and any taxes that you cut off of those homes, it automatically makes the homes more attractive to potential buyers. So it makes it that much more easier to compete.
Look, what we're seeing today from Poilievre is a stark contrast, a big wedge compared to what we've seen from the current government, right? Poilievre is saying cut the bureaucrats, cut the government's tax take, and encourage supply by reducing the tax burden that government puts on both developers and Canadians through higher taxes. But that is in stark contrast to what we're seeing from the current federal government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who continues to flirt with higher taxes on your home. And let me just give you a couple illustrations of this, okay? So in 2016, the Trudeau government made it mandatory for you to report the sale of your home with the CRA, with the taxman. Now, currently in Canada, there is no home equity tax, right? Currently. So when you sell your home, you're not paying tax on the proceeds, i.e. capital gains taxes, on the sale of that home. However, that 2016 reporting requirement with the CRA is a huge slippery slope step towards a capital gains tax on your home, a home equity tax. Now, why do we say that? Well, why does the CRA want to know how much you sell your home for? Is the taxman just curious? Well, I highly doubt it, right? But not just that. Remember, folks, the federal government spent hundreds of thousands of your tax dollars funding and promoting a report that recommends a form of home equity tax. Not just that, right? The federal government has brought in an anti-flipping tax. So if you sell your home faster than government bureaucrats think you should, well, the tax man is coming for you. Or an underused housing tax. So if you're not using your home or your property in the way the government thinks you should, well, tax man is coming for you. And not just that. Let's look at the recent capital gains tax increase from the last budget. That doesn't apply to the sale of your primary home, but if you have a cottage, if you have secondary residence, then you're paying tax on that. So the stark contrast is this. While Poilievre says he's going to cut taxes to build more homes and to make more homes more affordable, well, Trudeau is going in the exact opposite direction, continuing to flirt with new taxes on your home.
Well, and this also signals to us, and it validates something that we've said, because many people have said, well, all Poilievre's housing plan is that he's just going to mandate municipalities to build more homes, and that's it. That's not a plan. And what we've said to people is, well, that's just the only piece of the plan that he's actually voiced. There's no doubt going to be a lot more initiatives behind that, and those will be revealed as we get closer and closer to an election. So the announcement today signals to me that this is now, part two of his entire plan to actually build more homes quicker and bring down the price of homes. And I think it's interesting that he's announcing this now when the government is completely gridlocked and the government of the day can't move anything forward. So at this point, Pierre is probably not worried about Justin Trudeau stealing any of our ideas and implementing them, because he literally can't implement them because of the House being stalled. Now, if we look at pivoting from this really good news to a court ruling that came out recently regarding Airbnbs, that was concerning to Tanya and I when we actually read that. In that shows us that the tax man is starting to creep into that home equity. So for viewers that may not be that familiar with that, can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, so in a relatively recent decision from the Tax Court of Canada, it essentially means that homeowners that regularly or consistently rent through short-term rental or leasing apps like Airbnb, if you're doing it on a consistent basis, well, then you must pay the sales tax, right? So in Ontario, for example, that's what, a 13% HST. Right. So this is another example of that slippery slope that I mentioned to you, where the federal government continues to sniff around our homes for more and more money. So let's say you're consistently renting short-term leases on Airbnb. Well, let's say you sell your home for $1 million, then you're going to get slapped with the full HST, which is like $130,000 in tax. Right. That's just one example. But again, like, at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing here to understand is that it's a new tax burden around the sale of your home, right? So even if you're not impacted because, let's say, you're not consistently renting out your home on short-term leases through Airbnb, for example, it's once again another movement of the federal government, or governments, I should say, taxing your home. And let me go back to the big picture here, right? Because for many Canadians who aren't a politician, who don't work in government, well, you're not getting a taxpayer-funded pension, right? If you're working in the private sector. For the most part, your nest egg is the sale of your home to fund your golden years, right? So this is why we keep banging the drum against a potential home equity tax. And let me give you another example of just how damaging a home equity tax could be, okay? So I think it was a couple years ago, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation released a home equity tax calculator. And for example, if you bought your home, let's say in 1980 for like $250K, and you sold it today for like 1.25 million, well, a home equity tax could mean you're paying anywhere between like an extra 50 grand or an extra 190,000 bucks, right? So that means a couple things. Number one, you may have less money to fund your golden years. Number two, you may tack on some of the tax to the sale price, again, increasing prices. Or number three, you might just decide not to sell your home to avoid the big tax bill. And again, that reduces supply, increasing the housing market prices.
Well, and it strikes me that all this would do was de-incentivize people from actually selling these properties that would otherwise possibly, be sold to a family that is maybe going to move into them and actually live in them, because, okay, well, why do I want to pay that 13% HST now? I will just keep it. Thank you very much. And, I also have the capital gains on top of that. So, now you're getting hit from both angles, and it's a double whammy. And for Canadians that like to use their cottages, but also rent them out, now they're probably asking the question, okay, so I'm trying to now pay for both mortgages with renting it out to friends or family or just random people that are online, and then I get to use my cottage whenever I want on the off weekends in the summer. So they're asking the question, am I going to be hit by this 13% tax when I go to sell that cottage as well? So you're effectively going to be freezing a lot of this inventory that would otherwise be moved.
That's such a great point, right? What you're doing is you're discouraging people from putting their home or their rental property up on the market for sale to someone who may be looking to buy it as their primary residence. So again, you see this stark contrast from what current governments are doing, i.e., discouraging people from building homes, discouraging people from putting properties on the market for home sales, i.e., reducing supply and increasing prices. And then you get Polyev, who's doing the exact opposite, which is good. Cutting taxes, encouraging developers to build more homes, directly reducing the sale price for Canadian families buying a new home. Because remember, folks, at the end of the day, there's really two things that a government can do to encourage, or at least to try to make homes more affordable. There's the right way and there's the wrong way. The wrong way is to announce all these new programs, create this huge bureaucracy. That is the wrong way to do it. The right way to do it is to stop taking so much money from developers and from Canadian would-be home buyers in the first place. So again, I just want to illustrate the point that you're seeing a huge stark contrast between what the current government is doing, i.e. raising taxes, wasting a bunch of money on these programs that are not seeing success, and what Polyev is proposing, to just cut taxes, cut the bureaucracy, and make it easier for people to build and buy homes.
So I think the thing that concerns me the most about this Airbnb tax is the government essentially telling you what you can or cannot do with your property. Yep. The tax court is saying that because this is, you're using your property for commercial purposes, you're going to have to pay a tax. Now, lots of Canadians, including us, run a home business out of their home. I think what scares me is the government coming in and saying, oh, well, you're making money, you're using a part of your home for commercial purposes, now you have to pay a tax. Is that like just a crazy fear that I have, or do you think that could be a possibility?
No, wow. Okay, that's a really good point, and I'm happy you brought that up because I really hadn't considered that angle there. But I do feel like your concerns in terms of the government using the tax stick over someone's private property is a concern. And again, it kind of goes back to the slippery slope, right? I mentioned the government bringing an anti-flipping tax. So if you sell your home faster than the government thinks you should, you pay a tax, or an underused housing tax, right? So if you're not using your home as much as the government thinks you should, you pay a tax. Again, you see the government using the stick of taxation to essentially erode private property rights. Right? It's almost like do what we say or pay. So I do think that's a very good concern. It's not a concern that I thought of right away, so I'm really happy you brought it up. But again, like to the point of everything that we're kind of seeing from the government is that they continue down this slippery slope of new and higher taxation on Canadians' homes and therefore private property.
Well, and it falls away from, I think, what even psychologists even talk about is if you're trying to change behavior, the worst way to do that is to, provide negative reinforcement to people in order to prevent them from doing behavior, rather than providing positive reinforcement to encourage them to do something that you want them to do. And you see this from the Liberals constantly when they say, well, we're using the carbon tax to try and get people to cut down on their emissions rather than incentivizing people to cut down on their emissions if you want them to actually do that. So and that's one of the key differences that I see between the Conservative and the Liberal platform is the Liberals want to punish you for doing the things they don't want you to do, but the Conservatives want to reward people for doing things that they do want them to do.
Well, it's also just a mindset of like, oh, us government, political, bureaucratic elite know best how you should live your life. Right?
Pretty much.
That's essentially big bossy government using taxation to take more money from you and essentially them dictate how you should live your life. And specifically when it comes to the carbon tax, you have what? Political elites who get to expense taxpayers for flying across Canada, around the world. Same with bureaucrats. Right? Maybe they live in a downtown building close to Parliament Hill or what have you, punishing Canadians, the ones who are working class Canadians who keep the economy actually running, who need to fuel up their RAM to get to work and to work all day. Right? So it's one class, the elite class, using taxes to say you should live this way, and if you don't, we're going to make you pay.
Well, and I think the last thing that I'll touch on that is this capital gains increase, as well as this potential 13% sales tax, for the people that do decide to sell these homes, Well, what are you going to see? Well, you're going to see a 13% increase in the price of that home that they're going to put it on the market for in order to compensate for that 13% hit that they're going to take, and the extra percentage that is going to be gouged from them on the capital gains tax. So in raising these taxes to pay for programs that will lower the price of homes, they are in fact increasing the price of homes at the end of the day because of all of these extra expenses. It's insanity.
And can I just add one more thing that I think sometimes, gets forgotten in all these different types of tax hikes is that, remember, not only are you getting dinged and have to pay the tax, but you're also paying for a ballooning bureaucracy, right? That's especially the case if you have what's going on now, where you're going to have the CRA looking around, trying to figure out, what is too much short-term renting, trying to look around, figuring out the capital gains that people make when they sell their home. What you're doing is not only hitting the taxpayer directly, you're also hitting the taxpayer because you're ballooning the bureaucracy, right? And who has to pay for the additional bureaucrats in Ottawa? Taxpayers. And the CRA is already bloated, okay? So the CRA has about 60,000 bureaucrats. Now let's just provide an example and some context here. In Canada, there's one tax bureaucrat for every 700 citizens. Let's look at the IRS in the US, okay? In the US, there's one tax bureaucrat for every 4,000 citizens. One tax bureaucrat for every 700 citizens in Canada, one tax bureaucrat for every 4,000 citizens in the US under the IRS, right?
That's alarming.
It's alarming. Our bureaucracy is so bloated. And, to really nail home the point, Trudeau has added an extra 108,000 federal government employees. He has ballooned the total bureaucracy by 42% in less than a decade.
And services are worse than ever.
Well, and let's just kind of unpack that for everybody. So, the United States has 10 times our population, but they have a factor of 6 times fewer tax people per capita for the number of citizens. Like that's staggering. That is absolutely staggering. But well, and this is a great pivot because we've referenced the Canadian Taxpayer Federation's analysis on the cost of maintaining the carbon tax, which is around $400 million, and no doubt that's going to go up as they increase the carbon tax to 61 cents a liter. And we did a short episode on the carbon tax, tearing apart the liberal narrative on the recent report out of the Parliamentary Budget Office. So just for our sanity check, what did you glean from that report?
Yeah, I mean, surprise, surprise, the carbon tax the carbon tax is costing average families hundreds of dollars more than what they get back in rebates. A surprise to nobody outside of the political bubble in Ottawa. The carbon tax makes you worse off. And to go right into the numbers, the carbon tax will cost the average family up to about $400 this year, more than what they get back in rebates. Right? Hundreds of dollars more than what they get back in rebates. By 2030, that cost jumps up to $900 to the average family, more than what they get back in rebates. But wait, there's more bad news because those are annual costs, right? So if you add up all the costs every single year between now and the end of 2030, let's say for the average family in Ontario, well, the carbon tax will cost that average family in Ontario like $4,000 more than what they get back in rebates between now and the end of 2030. And oh wait, more bad news, because that's only for the consumer carbon tax. There's also an industrial carbon tax, and there's another carbon tax that Trudeau buried in fuel regulations. Okay, so like, here's the thing. The government charges a carbon tax, okay, and then it skims like $200 million plus off the top to hire the bureaucrats to administer the carbon tax. And then the government charges its sales tax on top of the carbon tax. And that sales tax on tax will cost Canadians about $400 million this year. And the government doesn't even pretend to rebate that tax on tax money to you. So, my family's all in southern Alberta in Lethbridge. And I like to say, if you think that the government can impose a carbon tax, skim hundreds of millions of dollars off the top, and then charge its sales tax on top of the carbon tax, and somehow make you better off with rebates than I've got some ocean view property in Lethbridge to sell you.
Well, let's talk about that afterwards. I'm interested in some ocean view property. But you'd have to squint really hard. And this is the other main point that we talked about regarding that report, is the amount of tax that is actually taken off, and they don't talk about that. And it's interesting because we haven't heard the Conservatives talk about that too much either, and I think that they should be adding that to their talking points, because I think by the end it was, I'm trying to recall, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of between it was a couple $2 billion by the end of 2030, I believe, in taxes. A previous analysis from the PBO, sorry to interrupt, but a previous analysis from the PBO looked at this carbon tax on tax, and removing the sales tax from the carbon tax alone would save about $6 billion between now and the end of 2030, or I should say last year and the end of 2030. Now, to the Conservative Party's credit, I believe one of their members of parliament has introduced a private member's bill to end the carbon tax on tax. So, a little bit of kudos to them for that. But to your point, not enough Canadians know that not only does the government tax the fuel, they're also taxing the taxes on the fuel. Well, and they're just, this is the epitome of cherry picking the stats out of the report. And no wonder that most likely they gave the requirement to the parliamentary budget officer to do these two different specific types of analysis, and that way they could cherry pick the one that they wanted versus the final summary, because that is the only reason that I can see that the report was actually constructed in this way.
Well, let me okay, so a couple things, right? So to your point, when you hear Prime Minister Justin Trudeau or his environment minister or some other cabinet minister in the Liberal government say, oh, you get more back than what you pay. Well, as we've already kind of discussed, that doesn't pass the sniff test, right? We all know that you can't give the government $50 and somehow get $100 back, right? That's pretty obvious. But when you hear the Liberal talking points, it's because they're not talking about all the costs of the carbon tax. Right? We all know the carbon tax makes it more expensive for you to fuel up your car. It makes it more expensive for you to heat your home. But there's all these indirect costs of the carbon tax, including economic costs of the carbon tax. For example, when you buy food, well, the farmer has to grow the food and pay carbon tax on that. The trucker has to deliver the food and pay carbon tax on that. And of course, the grocery store is also paying carbon tax on its heating energy, just to keep the grocery store at comfortable temperatures, right? So you're paying carbon tax all throughout the supply chain. And that's one of the reasons that the carbon tax has a huge economic hit on our economy, on workers, on investment, right? So when you hear them cherry pick the stat, it's because they're not talking about all the costs of the carbon tax. Well, you should talk about all the costs of the carbon tax, right? Ignoring some of the costs is like me telling you, hey, Ryan, my diet's going great if you don't count the 2 Big Macs and fries that I had on Friday night after I had a couple beers, right? It just doesn't make any sense. But the second thing I want to point out in the PBO report is that the PBO actually said something to the effect of Canada's emissions are not large enough to materially impact climate change, right? So a carbon tax that makes your life more expensive here in Canada is not an environmental solution. Right? Canada makes up 1.4% of global emissions. 4 of the 5 largest emitting countries, Russia, India, Brazil, and the United States of America, do not have a national carbon tax. In fact, about 70% of countries don't have a national carbon tax. So, what are we doing, folks?
Yeah, it's almost like, you're trying to make yourself poor in your own home in order to fix Canada's economy. It's about the same scale as what you're trying to impact here. And this is where it just blows my mind when the Liberals say, well, Pierre and the Conservatives, they don't have an environmental plan or a climate plan. It doesn't matter what you call it. Well, when when Pierre and the Conservatives talk about the fact that, listen, we're not going to punish Canadians for living their lives, we're going to incentivize green energy. Let's get small factor nuclear reactors across the country. Let's get more investment into our liquefied natural gas and export that to coal burning countries, thereby reducing their emissions. So, if they really want to get, comprehensive, then Canada could have a massive net reduction on global emissions if they're actually helping these other countries get off of coal and moving to much cleaner liquefied natural gas, to the point where once their infrastructure is then mature enough, then we can work with them to transitioning off of that down to nuclear. And that's a 50 to a 100 year plan. So that to me is a more comprehensive environmental plan than adding a carbon tax.
Well, the carbon tax is not an environmental plan.
It's a tax plan.
It's just not. It's just not. For two reasons, really. The number one reason I already, we just talked about. Excuse me, but if you're trying to make a senior who lives in Canada's lives more expensive just because they're trying to stay warm during the winter, that's not reducing emissions in India or Brazil or the United States, right? So that's
100%.
number one. You got to tackle the big side of the arithmetic here, and taxing grandma and grandpa for trying to stay warm during the winter. That's not the big side of the arithmetic. But number two is I'm going to get a little wonky over here, but you're taxing inelastic demand. You're taxing necessities, right? So people need to drive to work. Canada's a big place. People need to stay warm. Canada is a cold place. People need to eat food. That should go without saying, right? So it's not like people can just stop driving to work, stop staying warm during the winter, and stop eating. Of course not, right? So what the carbon tax is doing is not reducing the emissions. What the carbon tax is doing is just leaving less money in people's pockets for the other necessities of life.
Well, and if you really want to, distill this down to sanity versus insanity, we have these necessities that we absolutely need, but the government has chosen to throw all this money behind dental care, which many people, have dental insurance, pharmacare, which many people have pharmacare insurance, and programs that, frankly, the vast majority of Canadians will never utilize in their lives. But that's where we're spending all of our tax money. And it doesn't mean that those programs aren't helpful to the people that they're being targeted to, but it's when you only have a certain amount of money in your budget at the end of the month, you're not going to go out and buy a Ferrari.
But even beyond that, the government is not only spending money on programs that very few Canadians may use, they're spending it on waste. And I think that's the big issue here. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, it's a huge issue. I would say it's probably a combination of both, right? We talk about waste. Well, the federal government spent $8 million building a barn at Rideau Hall. Now, I don't know the first thing about building barns, but I'm pretty sure my buddies back home in Brooks know how to build a barn for less than $8 million.
Well, they also spent $60 million on building an app, and I can tell you, I know all about building apps. So
that two independent techies, they built the app over a Thanksgiving long weekend, but somehow it cost the government $60 million. Or Global Affairs Canada spending an average of $50,000 a month on booze. We mentioned Trudeau adding 108,000 extra bureaucrats in less than a decade. What about, Trudeau on his 6-day trip to the Indo-Pacific in September of 2023, him and his entourage spent $220,000 on airplane food. Or the Governor General spending 70 grand on limos in Iceland for 4 days. There is so much waste, but there's also the government is doing too much poorly, right? So you can't spend more money on everything forever. That just doesn't add up. You end up getting into a situation that Canada is now, where interest charges on the debt blow a $1 billion hole in the budget every single week, right? So now the federal government is spending more money on interest charges on the debt than what it sends to the provinces in health transfers. Or here's another little tidbit, right? Every time you're paying the GST, every penny the government collects from you in the federal sales tax is going to pay interest on the debt.
Right? It's staggering when you think about what impact this has on everything. And when you hear the Liberals then talk about the analysis from the parliamentary budget officer and say, well, our fiscal position, he said it's sustainable. Okay, so it's sustainable for you,
for the
it's
government, not for
sustainable.
taxpayers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
But-
it is insanity.
I don't want to keep throwing all these numbers at you, fine folks, but let me just give you another one from the PBO. The government is already on track to be $6 billion over budget. So
Yep.
Trudeau released his budget back in April, 6 months ago. 6 months, $6 billion over budget. Like they're running a $40 to $46 billion deficit. Like, it's 2024. Look around. There's no pandemic. It is absolutely embarrassing and unacceptable that the government is running a $40 billion plus deficit.
Well, especially when he said, "Oh, our deficits will never be above 10 billion," and the fact that they talked about these financial guardrails that they all had in place. We're not going to go over the 38 billion that we're going to be spending this year. And surprise, surprise. You're 6 billion over, and we're 6 months
And the
into
budget
the year.
didn't balance itself.
Oh, magically.
Still waiting.
So yeah, the balanced budget is at that Ocean View property in Lethbridge. That's where that is. So
Got it.
So if you want to know more about the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, if you want to support them, head on over to their YouTube channel, give them a follow, subscribe, watch their videos to get more informed. Head on over to their website, which you can find in the description. And Franco, thank you so much for joining us on Northern Perspective, and we hope to see you again.
Hey, my pleasure. Always happy to have this chat with you guys.